Hey guys, this is The View from the Cherry Tree, Chapter 5. He was getting better at spitting cherry pits. He got a few of them onto Mrs. Calloway's windowsill. Of course he cheated, moving a little further along the big branch than usual, but it was worth it. The cat yowled at him, eyeing the sandwich. Rob broke off a corner and extended it, then put it down on a branch where the cat could pick it up by himself. The cat expertly sought out the meat, then shook his head, flattening his ears, moving away. He stared with contemptuous yellow eyes, tail twitching his displeasure. "I like it with mustard," Rob informed him. "If you're so fuzzy, make your own sandwiches." Somewhere in Mrs. Calloway's house, someone turned on the phonograph. It was an old tinny sounding thing, and she must be deaf because it was turned up sort of loud. He remembered one time when Teddy had been playing her stereo that loud, and the old witch called the police. He thought about calling the police on her, but he knew at once they wouldn't like that either. They'd be mad at him no matter what he did. "I will not," Mrs. Calloway said sharply. Rob shifted position a little so that he could rest his back against the tree trunk. The lace curtains weren't blowing much today, and he couldn't see into her house except when she came right close to the window. She did this now, pushing aside the limp lace to stare down at the cherry pits. "Such a nasty boy. I can't think why they tolerate him," she said, her mouth curling with distaste. The binoculars swung on their strap against her scrawny bosom. "How does he get them up here on my windowsill?" He thought he heard someone say something to her, but it was hard to tell with the music playing all loud and scratchy the way it was. She turned her head, and this time he was sure there was someone in the room with her, for she said, "You must be out of your mind to think I'd agree to any such thing." She had reached to one side and scooped up a newspaper from the table. Now she used it to push the cherry pits off onto the ground, her lips clamped together tightly together. The cat saw the movement and began to creep toward her out along the big limb. Rob opened his mouth to speak to call him back, but already it was too late. The old woman had spotted the cat, and Rob hated to give away his own position. If she knew he spent so much time up the tree, she'd have him arrested for being a peeping Tom or something, and then they wouldn't let him sit here any more. "Go on, get away, you nasty thing." She leaned toward him, her head and shoulders out the window, swatting at the cat. The cat was a hardened customer, however, unafraid. He was poised to spring. Rob slid one foot downward, seeking the limb he knew was there, ready to reach out and grab the cat when it happened. It was so fast he could hardly take in what he had seen, although later he was able to put it all together as if in slow motion. It took much longer to tell about it than it did to happen. Mrs. Calloway was leaning through the window with her cat ready to spring. Perhaps he remembered the taste of that goldfish and that there were more of them in there. Through that open window. Suddenly, the old lady was lifted off her feet through the opening, surprise causing her to emit a small squeak. That's all, only a squeak, like a cornered mouse. For just a second, Rob saw the hands that had pushed her. Big hands, a man's hands, surely, and the cat, alarmed by the figure coming toward him, bounded from the branch into the house. Rob heard a muffled grunt, saw the cat disappear, and blood oozing up in ridges on the man's forearms when the cat's claws had raked him. And then the arms were gone. The lace curtain hung limply across the opening, and he couldn't see into the house any longer. All of that he saw in seconds. Less than seconds. While Mrs. Calloway was falling, flailing with her arms and legs, and then she gave a gurgling, choked cry and was silent. Rob stared down into her face, which was looking straight up at him and slowly turning blue. The leather strap of the binoculars had twisted about her neck, and as she fell had caught around the big branch, the one that had been cut off when it approached the side of her house. It was thick enough to hold her meager weight as she swung there, her toes dangling only a foot or two off the ground. Her glasses had gone askew, tipped by a branch or perhaps one of her own clawing hands, for she tried to loosen the strap at her neck. Her eyes up close were a pale blue. They bulged as if they were being squeezed out of her, and her mouth gaped, working soundlessly, then not at all. Rob was frozen above her in the tree looking down, unbelieving, as the intelligence in the eyes, the fear, the agony faded. He opened his mouth, trying to yell, because he could hear people behind him at his own house, but he couldn't make any noise, not even a squeak. The bulging eyes continued to stare up at him, sightless now. He knew they couldn't see him. The small body swung gently, turning a little on the leather strap. His chest hurt as if his own breathing had been cut off. Rob shot one frantic glance after Cat, but there was no way of getting him back, short of climbing over that awful swinging body, which he could not do. If they found the cat in the house, maybe they'd say it was his fault, and they'd put him to sleep, or something. He ought to go after the cat, and he couldn't. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. And then his foot slipped, and he fell forward, almost onto it. Already he thought of her that way, as it, not a person but a thing. He actually brushed against the swinging body as he fell. He didn't feel the twigs that scraped his face and his arms, didn't know when he struck the ground. He doubled his legs under him, and they took him toward the back door. His hands didn't seem to work right as he scrabbled with the door, and he stumbled going across the threshold. The house was full of people, their faces blurring before his eyes. "Leave the pieces, huh, boy?" Mr. Mallory bent over to right a chair Rob didn't even know he'd overturned. "Where have you been? Your mother wanted you to—" It didn't register whatever his mother wanted him to do. It took 2 tries before the words came, gasping, puffing, almost not words at all. "She's dead. Mrs. Calloway is dead. She's hanging in the cherry tree." None of their faces changed. Mr. Mallory sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Rob, I'm sorry if this weekend is boring you, but the rest of us are busy, and we haven't got time for any more of your foolishness. Do you understand?" There seemed to be a roaring noise in his ears, as if something were gushing through his head under pressure. "No, it's not. Dad, she really is dead. She's hanging in the cherry tree, and the cat went through her window. He's in her house. He didn't have anything to do with it. Honest, he didn't, but she's just hanging there, and her eyes are squeezed out." They really looked at him then. Mrs. Mallory rose slowly from the chair where she had been sitting, hemming Darcy's dress. "Robert Walter Mallory, if you're making this up—" He shook his head, pleading for them to believe him, feeling as if he'd been running for blocks. "I'm not, Mom. She's dead. She's really dead." The color left his mother's face. "Maybe you'd better go see, Wally." Their faces reflected now his own horror. They were beginning to believe, at least, that he thought what he was saying was the truth. "How could you possibly know?" Darcy asked slowly. "I know. I was looking at her when she died." His words echoed hollowly. Mr. Mallory moved toward the door, not running but moving fast, and the rest of them followed. Rob didn't know if he wanted to go out there again or not. He had a horrid notion that he was going to dream about Mrs. Calloway swinging and swaying from the branch of the cherry tree with her eyes bugging out. He felt a little sick to his stomach. They poured out into the sunlit yard like a swarm of ants over spilled syrup, and then slowed. His father had reached her, put his arms up, lifting the frail old body. Funny how little she looked. Rob had never thought of her as being so tiny. Walt Mallory looked toward the house. "Come here, somebody. Steve, give me a hand. Get that damn strap off of there. Teddy, call the ambulance." Teddy was halfway back to the house when he followed that up with the final command. "Better call the police, too, I guess." With Steve freeing the strap from the stump of the limb, the old woman was lifted down and stretched out on the grass. Rob stayed where he was, beside his own house. He could see all he wanted to see from there. He wondered if the cat would come if they called him at the open window, but he didn't want to walk over so close to it to find out. Mr. Mallory and Steve were kneeling beside the old woman. His mother, who had gone halfway to them, called out, Is she really?" Mr. Mallory stood up. "Yes, looks like she's strangled on that confounded binocular strap. Of all the stupid things, there isn't anything anybody can do for her now, I'm afraid." Mrs. Mallory retreated to Rob's side, putting one hand on his shoulder. She was trembling. "Dear heaven, of all times for such a thing to happen. What did happen, Rob? She just fell out the window?" He opened his mouth, but Teddy's words covered his own as she came running back outside. "They're coming, both of them, the ambulance and the police. Is she really dead?" Steve came toward them across the grass. "She's dead, all right. Man, talk about a freaky accident. Another foot and she'd have been able to stand up. Hey, what's going on? Holding a convention? They all looked toward the street where Max was coming toward them, smiling. I had such a hassle with the old lady Calloway yesterday. I thought I'd better park around the corner this time. What's going on? He read their expression then, and a moment later spotted the limp small figure on the grass. Hey, what happened? It's Mrs. Calloway, Teddy said, torn between horror and excitement. I called an ambulance, but Daddy and Steve says she's dead. Max swallowed. How come? I mean, what happened? She fell out the window and hanged herself in the cherry tree with the binocular strap, Steve explained. Rob saw her fall. I wouldn't go look at her if I were you. She isn't pretty. I have no desire to look at her, Max assured him. Holy moly, what a thing to happen. Behind them in the house, the telephone began to chime. For a moment, nobody moved. Teddy, get the phone. His mother might have been rooted there beside him, her fingers digging into his shoulder. Dear God, I don't think I can take much more today. There are the sirens. Now I suppose everybody within blocks will be out here. Mr. Mallory was still standing beside the body. Yes, why don't you all go in the house? I'll talk to them when they come. Darcy, Teddy poked her head out a window. It's the bakery calling back. There's been some kind of mix-up on your cake. They had the date down wrong for next Saturday. Darcy, who was already pale, began to shake. They couldn't have it wrong. They couldn't. I saw them mark it in the book, the 17th. I saw it. Well, I don't know. That's what they said. Somebody better talk to them. Mrs. Mallory inhaled deeply, releasing Rob. Well, if they made a mistake, they better start working double time because they're going to have a cake to feed 300 people at the reception hall by noon tomorrow, or else. Will you talk to them, Darcy? Mom, please, Mom. Darcy looked as if she was going to cry. Don't worry, they'll have a cake if they all have to stay up all night making it. Mrs. Mallory strode up the steps in a way that made Rob glad it wasn't him she was mad at. Rob stood where he was as the rest of the family re-entered the house, listening to the approaching sirens. They were almost here, and he hadn't gotten the cat out of the house next door. And maybe they'd seal it up or something, and the cat wouldn't be able to get out. And then he saw him, the cat creeping along the side of Miss Calloway's house. Rob felt a slight relaxation of his muscles. At least the cat had come out. He wouldn't be trapped in there. He watched his father meet the police at the curb. There were two of them, both men his father knew. They talked for a minute there on the sidewalk, and then they all walked up to stand over Mrs. Calloway, one of them shaking his head. It was about then that Rob began to go over the events in his mind, how old lady Calloway had been leaning out the window, and those hands had come out and pushed her, and the old cat had scratched the man on the arms. He understood how anybody might have wanted to push her out the window, and it wasn't as if anybody could expect to murder her that way. As Steve had remarked, she might not have been hurt at all if she'd fallen to the ground. If it hadn't been for that crazy binocular strap catching on a sawed-off limb, she could have escaped without even a broken bone. So he didn't feel that he could walk over to the officers and tell them the woman had been murdered. But he ought to tell them there had been somebody with her in the house, somebody who'd pushed her. There had been something on one of the old Perry Mason reruns about a man who killed somebody, but he hadn't meant to, and they hadn't charged him with first-degree murder. Rob tried to remember exactly what had happened on the show, but it got too mixed up with other shows in his mind. Well, the thing to do was tell his father. He'd know what to do about it if anything needed to be done.